So
Perfect, great. So, welcome everyone, and it's great to have so many of you here, well over 100 already. And like I said, there's more than 200 who've registered, so there might be a few more joining us. And a special welcome to our Landscape Ecology UK members. So this is a special edition of our Landscape Connections webinars that we've been running for a few years now. And once a year, we have a more high-profile Bunce Lecture. This is one of them, and we're delighted to have so much interest, to have the great speakers and the great panel. The webinar is organised by Landscape Ecology UK, and we're the UK region of the International Association of Landscape Ecology. My name is Mark Metzger. I'm the president of Landscape Ecology UK. And we are a small organisation run by an enthusiastic group of volunteers that promote landscape ecology in the UK, that help to bridge research, policy and practice around landscape ecology, and also to support and connect landscape ecologists, and especially early career and student landscape ecologists. For those that don't already know, landscape ecology is a very interdisciplinary, or I would maybe even say undisciplined, that looks at the interactions across space and time between the structure and function of physical, biological, and cultural component of landscapes. So it brings lots of different types of expertise together. This annual Bunce Lecture is dedicated to Bob Bunce, who helped establish Landscape Ecology UK, or IALA UK as it was known at the time. He was president of IALA UK for a good number of years. He helped to establish IALA Europe as a chapter, and has been president of the global IALA movement as well. In the UK, Bob is probably best known for starting off a number of influential surveys, most notably the Countryside Survey, but also the Woodland Survey that has been resurveyed in the last few years. And quite often you hear people talk about bunce plots in relation to woodlands. Well, they were established by Bob. But in addition to his legacy in these surveys, he has a broader legacy that Claire Wood summarized nicely in a paper that she published this year that actually focused on his surveys. But he was also known for his inspiration internationally for other monitoring schemes in Sweden, Spain, and Austria, his leadership within the International Association for Landscape Ecology, and also his mentorship of students and colleagues while working in the UK and later also in the Netherlands, Spain, and Estonia. And we just want to commemorate Bob with this series of webinars. So today we're here for Julia Jones's talk on nature markets and saving nature's lessons from voluntary markets for forest carbon credits and the emerging biodiversity credit market. Julia is Professor of Conservation Science at Bangor University and holds the position of the Prince Bernhard Chair in International Nature Conservation at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. She sits on the boards of WWF and JCNC and has extensive experience in conservation impact evaluation and the impacts of conservation interventions. So, as I said, she will be talking today about nature markets and saving nature. And her talk will be followed by a panel discussion, panel reflections and discussion before we open things up to a wider Q&A. If you do have questions, you can drop them in the chat, but there'll also be the opportunity to raise your hands and ask them personally in 45 minutes or so. There's also the opportunity to stay after the webinar for our annual meeting for those who want to learn a bit more about Landscape Ecology UK. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over the screen to Julia. Technology working well, I can stop sharing my screen and Julia will be able to share hers and start with her lecture. Over to you, Julia.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark, for the nice introduction. And just to emphasize that I am speaking, of course, on my own, in my own academic right and not representing JNCC or WWF, of course, today. So when I was first invited to give this talk and I was starting to reflect on what I was going to talk about in this huge honor of being asked to speak at in this lecture series that's named for Bob Bunce, I happen to be out in the field with our first year ecology and conservation students. Can whoever's unmuted mute, because I'm getting the most awful feedback. Fantastic. Thank you so much. There I was in the field reflecting on the huge legacy of Bob Bunce, but also his mentors at the time. So John Harper was one of his mentors. There really were the greats at Bangor at the time. And I was reflecting that I hope that they would appreciate that the subject has continued to go from strength to strength. Our students continue to be deeply passionate about ecology and conservation. So I've decided to try to answer a question in this talk. So my question ultimately is, will nature markets contribute to effective nature conservation and recovery? And before delving in, we really do need a definition. So I'm going to define nature markets as mechanisms that allow investment in nature by trading credits that represent some kind of nature-related outcome. This could be biodiversity. It could be carbon removals, so removing of carbon from the atmosphere by creating or restoring carbon-rich ecosystems. Could be avoidance of carbon emissions, so that's by protecting carbon-rich ecosystems, such as avoiding deforestation. Or it could be nutrient mitigation, flood protection, etc. And there is huge interest in nature markets at the moment, as reflected by how many people signed up for this seminar, perhaps. And this is for a number of reasons. So firstly, I mean, this audience doesn't need telling that nature provides vital services, but there's real concern that if these services are not captured by markets, nature essentially becomes undervalued in decision making. Another related reason is that markets could be an efficient way to fund nature conservation and recovery. And both of these points are captured in this quote from the President of the European Commission. She was talking about the emerging biodiversity credit market at the moment, but it applies more broadly. So she says, we have to put nature on the balance sheet. That's what nature credits do. When well designed, they provide an efficient market-driven instrument that encourages the private sector to invest and innovate. And I think this captures the sort of main reason, or one of the main reasons for the interest in nature markets. But another one, which I think is very important as well, is, of course, with the pressures that there are at the moment on public sector budgets, policymakers are keen for the private sector to help meet nature conservation and recovery targets. So that's another reason I think there's so much attention at the moment. But nature markets are difficult for a whole range of reasons. So firstly, a market needs a currency. And there's a question of what is a unit of nature? Now, this is more difficult in some of the markets that we're going to be touching upon today than others, but it's definitely a challenge. What is the unit of nature that the market can be measured in? Also, for a market to function, you need a way of knowing that if you've paid for something, that it's been delivered, that there's more of it than there would have been without the payment. This is often known as the additionality problem. So if there's been some nature creation paid for, how do you know that that's additional to what would have happened in the absence of the payment? But there's other challenges. So for a market to work, there needs to be buyers, and nature is inherently a public good. So we can all benefit from the services that nature provides without paying for it. So to create a market, that's going to depend, or that depends on regulation. That's key to creating a demand signal for these credits. But there's all sorts of other challenges as well. An important one is who loses out and who gains when you create a market in nature. And there's also issues around permanence of credits, of the outcomes that have been created, leakage, all sorts of issues. I'm just going to focus in this talk on the first two, these measurement challenges. And as a heads up for where the talk is going, I'm going to present some serious issues illustrated with some of my own research, but I'm going to be somewhat cautiously optimistic about these markets and willing to, and explaining why I'm willing to engage in sort of helping them to improve. Okay, so the first challenge to discuss is this question of the units being used in nature markets. So for carbon credits that are, they're ultimately about avoiding emissions from conserving nature that otherwise would be lost, or restoring or creating carbon-rich ecosystems for nature-based removals projects. Although there can be measurement challenges, ultimately we know what the unit is. The unit ultimately is tons of CO2 equivalent. That's pretty straightforward. However, when you're trading biodiversity, that's much more difficult because, of course, what is a unit of nature? What's a unit of biodiversity? I was involved in a really interesting review led by Hannah Walcott from Edinburgh University last year called What is a Unit of Nature? Measurement Challenges in the Emerging Biodiversity Credit Market. And in that, we reviewed around 40 different methodologies that were in circulation at the time, and I'm sure that number has gone up, and the metrics that they use to quantify nature. And of course, England is ahead of the game on this. So since February 2024, all new developments in England have been required to deliver a 10% uplift in biodiversity. And of course, you can't require an uplift in something, an increase in something, unless you can measure that thing. So this has required a metric to measure biodiversity. And in the lead up to the introduction of mandatory net gain in England, England developed their statutory biodiversity metric. And this essentially combines the area of parcels with the distinctiveness of the habitat in that parcel. So each of the habitats in the UK HABS classification has been assigned a distinctiveness, its strategic significance, and finally the condition of that habitat patch, which is measured in the field by ecologists going out to the field. And there's been a number of really excellent studies exploring how well the statutory metric correlates with other measures of biodiversity, such as species richness or presence of rare species, for example. So work led by Nat Dufus at Oxford, or Cecilia Marshall, who I think is at Cambridge. But I'm going to present some work hot off the press led by a PhD student of mine, Yvonne Salamanca-Leon, who's at Bangor University. And her work is explicitly addressing the question of how well England's statutory metric can measure change. So it's not about what it's correlating with, but it's how well it can measure change in biodiversity as defined by the statutory metric. So we're looking here at the result of a simple simulation. So this is a simulation assuming that there's a habitat patch that's in poor condition when it's first visited. It's visited again and it's still in poor condition. And we've run this simulation to illustrate just how important it is that habitat condition is measured reliably. So a habitat in poor condition is scored a 1 in a metric. Habitat in moderate condition is scored 2 in the metric. Going from 1 to 2 is a 100% increase. Going from 2 down to 1 is only a 50% decline. So that creates an inbuilt sort of bias, you could say, towards detecting an uplift even when there is no uplift to be detected. So what this simulation shows is going on the x-axis, you're increasing the variability in those condition assessments. So instead of necessarily saying it's poor condition when it's poor condition, there's a chance that you say it's in moderate condition. And as that increases, the uplift measured will increase. So the true uplift in this context, of course, is 0 because it's going from poor to poor. But if you increase the amount of variability, you could detect a 10% uplift, even though there is no uplift present. Now, of course, we needed an estimate. So the point this is making is that variability in habitat condition assessment is really important. It can lead to detection of an uplift even when none occurs. So we needed an estimate of the real world amount of variability. Ideally, we would have taken professional B&G ecologists out to the field during spring and summer to go to the same site to apply the criteria. But you know how difficult it is getting hold of professional ecologists, particularly during the season. The other alternative would have been to use students, but we felt that was much less relevant because we wanted to know how professional ecologists vary in the way they would assess the same location. So we ended up using an online survey. And we showed videos and photographs taken by an expert BNG ecologist, Ben Bennett, to ecologists. They were either shown an example in good condition or poor condition of 4 different habitat types. And I will save the results from this, but the headline is that for some habitats and scenarios, the variability that we detected was sufficient to measure a 10% uplift, even when there's no change in the condition, the underlying condition. So this finding, combined with the work that shows somewhat limited relationships between the metric and many measures of biodiversity that would be of interest to ecologists, might lead you to expect me to be saying that I don't have much faith in the BNG policy. But that couldn't actually be further from the truth. And that's because, in a way, it doesn't matter how perfectly BNG is measuring biodiversity, because it is doing its job at putting nature on the balance sheet. So earlier this year, I had a student, a Bangor University student, did some work looking at how the requirements for BNG have influenced house building in England. So he interviewed a number of house builders, and he has an interesting background. He actually has worked as a civil engineer for many years, had no real interest or exposure to ecology or conservation. And it was through the kind of change in the way his industry was working that he came back to university to do a master's in conservation. And something that really came out from his interviews was that BNG is absolutely putting nature on the balance sheet. So some quotes here, for example, I would say the most notable change is how people now consider biodiversity at the earliest point. BNG is definitely a game changer. Another quote says, there's definitely a shift in the development life cycle, whereas ecology may have come just prior to when you submit your planning application. Now the ecology bit is helping to inform a layout. Now, as an academic, it's easy for us to kind of point out limitations. You know, we go into things in a lot of detail, and our research shows that, you know, there are definite challenges with that metric. It has, however, also pointed to lessons of how the metric could be improved. My PhD students spent a lot of time interviewing BNG ecologists to understand about the training they go through, the opportunities for mentoring, etc. She's also been looking in a little bit into how AI tools with ecologists in the loop could reduce the variability in these habitat condition assessments. But the take home is not those kind of details. The bigger picture is, I think, the take home, which is that BNG is putting nature on the balance sheet. Okay, so the second part I want to focus on in my talk is, how do we know that the nature that's been paid for in a nature market has actually been delivered, that there is more nature relative to a counterfactual of the project not having happened? And that is really difficult. This is the problem that I spend a lot of my academic life working on, this question of how can you tell whether a conservation intervention has had the impacts that you want it to have had or not? It is inherently unobservable. You can't observe the world with and without a conservation project. That makes it really hard to be sure that your conservation project, funded perhaps through nature credits, has delivered what it's meant to have delivered. So this additionality problem, as it's often known, it applies in the context of the peatland code and the woodland carbon code, because of course the integrity of the scheme depends on knowing that the restoration wouldn't have just happened anyway without the credits being bought. So in these two examples, the test that's used is financial additionality. So this is essentially showing that the restoration project wouldn't have been possible without the investment from selling credits. But I want to focus on the scandal associated with the sale of REDD+ credits. So these are credits from reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And I had the unpleasant experience of having a front row seat in the scandal that blew up the voluntary carbon market in these credits. And this came down to this additionality question. So over the last couple of decades, projects have sprung up around the world that fund forest conservation through the sale of carbon credits that are sold to the voluntary carbon market and used mostly as offsets. And by the early 2020s, there was about $2 billion a year of trading on the voluntary carbon market. And then in early 2023, a piece was published in The Guardian claiming that 90% of these REDD+ credits were worthless. The fallout was dramatic and immediate. So the article came out during the World Economic Forum at Davos. Whole sessions were cancelled and reconfigured. In the months that followed, a series of other scandals also hit the market. The CEO of the largest certifier of credits resigned, and $1 billion was wiped off the value of the voluntary carbon market. The article wasn't a surprise to me. I was co-author on one of the papers that fed into the Guardian's calculations, and I'd also commented on the calculations that the Guardian had been doing. And essentially, there were two main pieces of research that fed into the Guardian headline. So firstly, some work led by Alejandro Guizar-Coutinho, who at the time was a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and I was involved in co-supervising his project, which was essentially a global analysis of how much these projects slowed deforestation. And then work led by Thales West, looking at how the number of credits that were sold by these projects compared with robust independent estimates of avoided deforestation. They looked at a overlapping suite of projects. So we're landscape ecologists, so it's nice to look at a landscape. So I thought I'd start with how the first generation, these early REDD+ projects worked in terms of how they came up with how many credits to issue. Essentially, you have your project area and you'd have a reference area that at least theoretically should have be exposed to the same level of deforestation as the project area. And then a model is applied to predict how much deforestation is likely to happen in the project area going forward. That's done ex ante, so looking forward. And then after the project has finished, you look back at how much deforestation happened in the project area, and you compare the difference between that ex ante baseline and deforestation in the project area to estimate avoided deforestation. Now, how the quasi-experimental approaches work, these independent these are ex post evaluations. So at the end of the project period, both approaches essentially rely on sampling the project area, taking similar samples from the wider landscape, and then matching, and there's different approaches used in the different papers, matching to select samples from the wider landscape that are matched in terms of obvious confounders, so factors that could affect both where a project gets put and deforestation. So this is things like elevation, slope, travel time to urban centres, distance to deforestation. And you then compare deforestation rates in these quasi-experimental controls, so the purple blobs, with, and this line should be orange, the deforestation rate in the project area. And that's the avoided deforestation estimated. And the difference between that, the estimate under the project approach using their baseline and this estimate is the degree of overcrediting, how much projects have overcredited. Now, there was real pushback from the industry against the Guardian article, and they went and looked closely at the underlying papers and pushed back at some aspects of the underlying papers. And one critique is absolutely fair enough. So these estimates these quasi-experimental methods depend on controlling for observable confounders between the creation of a REDD+ project and the outcome of interest, deforestation. So these are essentially how they estimate the impact is by controlling for these observable confounders like slope, elevation, etc. But they are assuming that there are no unobservable confounders. If project developers had private information about drivers of deforestation that are not captured in these global data sets used by these quasi-experimental studies, and that those local drivers of deforestation also affect placement of projects, it's absolutely true that these quasi-experimental studies could well have underestimated the true avoided deforestation. So that's a really important question, is could these unobserved confounders explain this discrepancy between what the projects were saying these projects delivered and what the independent academics suggested these projects had delivered? And this reminded us of a famous debate between the British statistician R.A. Fisher and the American statistician Jerome Cornfield. So back in the 1950s, the evidence for an association between smoking and lung cancer was irrefutable. Despite what the adverts suggested, people who smoked weren't more glamorous and handsome. They were more likely to get lung cancer. But there was a real debate as to whether it was smoking itself that was causing the lung cancer, or whether there was some third variable that this unobserved confounder that both made you more likely to smoke and more likely to have lung cancer. And this is what Fisher was arguing. I don't know if there was some self-interested reasoning happening there. He was himself a smoker, and he also took money from the tobacco lobby. But Jerome Cornfield's observation was, his insight was that if this confounding variable is responsible for the association that we see between smoking and lung cancer, then the association between that variable and your chance of smoking and your chance of lung cancer must be just as big as that observed association. And so it was then left on those defending smoking to say, well, what could that unobserved confounder be? Because it would have to be such a large confounder, and there wasn't a known variable that was even that strongly associated with either smoking or with lung cancer. And essentially, we've applied this reasoning to in some recent work, and we applied the same methods to confirm that overcrediting in the first generation of REDD+ projects is absolutely real, and it was not caused by hidden confounders. And that work is under review at the moment. And another thing that we've done in some recent work is we've also been looking in a little bit more detail, so at the overcrediting issue more generally, and it's absolutely irrefutable that overcrediting happened in these first generation of credits traded on the voluntary carbon market from REDD+ projects. But a bad credit is not the same as a bad project. Many of these projects did slow deforestation. So we have good evidence from our quasi-experimental ex-post evaluations that they slowed deforestation. The problem is that they weren't slowing deforestation as much as they were selling more credits than justified by the amount that was sold. So do these additionality challenges mean that we should focus only on nature-based removals and avoid these kind of complicated situations where you're doing nature-based avoidance, where you're having to estimate how much of your carbon-rich ecosystem would have disappeared without the investment in the project? I would say not, and it's for two main reasons. So firstly, while it can be easier perhaps to demonstrate additionality in nature-based removals projects than it is in nature-based avoidance, so if you're creating a woodland and there was no woodland there before, it's you can say there is at least now a woodland there. There are still additionality challenges. So the financial additionality test used in the Woodland Carbon Code is, of course, excellent and well designed, but it's still a challenge to show for sure that a project wouldn't have happened without the investment. But more importantly, I think the analogy of the atmosphere as a bathtub works really well. If your bathtub is overflowing, and that's the problem, of course, that Paddington is facing here, you've got two options. You can ladle out water from your bath, your removals, but it probably makes more sense to turn the taps off first. And while in places in the world where we still have a lot of loss of carbon-rich ecosystems, nature-based avoidance need to be a priority for funding, and voluntary carbon markets or other ways of funding the maintenance of those carbon ecosystems is a priority. Okay, so summing up, will nature markets contribute to effective nature conservation and recovery? Firstly, not automatically. This is key. So these markets need careful design with clarity of what the objective is to ensure that they're delivering for nature rather than just becoming a bureaucratic hurdle that delivers very little. Secondly, these nature markets cannot replace public sector investment in nature. They also require regulation and they require close oversight, and inevitably public sector involvement is going to be crucial to that. You can't just create a market, leave it to run and hope for the best. And this is a slightly technical academic point, but I think it is important. The increased focus on robustly measuring outcomes, which has come from a shift to private sector money and markets, I think it is positive for nature conservation and recovery. I think for too long, there's been limited attention given to demonstrating when conservation projects are genuinely delivering. And that's something, that kind of scrutiny that's come from the shift towards increasing proportions of money for conservation coming from markets, I think is generally quite positive. I think it is important that we can measure the outcomes of these kind of approaches. And then finally, I think this is a hugely important and dynamic area, and there's huge interest from policymakers, from practice-based organisations, from industry. There's real innovation coming from industry, and of course from academics. And I think the collaborations between those groups are really important to ensure the best possible outcomes. And of course, I want to emphasise that my work in this area is done with a variety of brilliant people who inspire and challenge me daily. So credit to them. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Julia. I see lots of hearts and claps and other icons appearing at the bottom of the screen. That was a wonderful oversight, and really nice also to see my colleague here from Edinburgh, Hannah, mentioned in your talk. Great. So can I ask our panelists to turn their cameras on if they feel comfortable to do so? I think that should be okay. So before opening things up to a general Q&A from the audience, we've invited 4 panelists to give some reflections on Julia's lecture. So we have Ross Johnston, who's Head of Natural Capital Policy and Valuation at the Scottish Government. We have Rob Jordan, who leads the North Devon UNESCO Biosphere Natural Capital Marketplace. We have Catherine Howell, who's Head of Natural Capital Developments at Bano Bichinio National Park Authority. And we have Julia McCarthy, who's a research associate at the University of Edinburgh with me, and who works on different aspects of nature finance. And I've asked these wonderful people to reflect for about 5 minutes on Julia's talk, to first introduce themselves and explain their interest in nature markets and saving nature, to then give their reflections on Julia's talk and how that relates to their experience, and also to reflect on how the challenges of establishing high integrity nature markets in the UK could be overcome, because there are challenges abound. So we'll start off with Ross. Ross is will need to catch a ferry home later this afternoon, so he'll have to leave us a little bit earlier. Yeah. So Ross, I'll give you the floor first.
Right, thanks Mark, and thanks Julia for a really interesting presentation. First, to introduce myself, I have worked for over 30 years in kind of nature conservation, environmental work in Scotland in a variety of roles. But for the last 5 years, I've been in Scottish Government, and as Mark says, sort of focusing on natural capital, with the kind of opportunities, but also the risks from private investment in natural capital forming an increasing part of not just my work, but the work of a wider partnership across the Scottish public sector, looking at both the risks and opportunities from natural capital markets. So, I mean, I suppose the first reflection is on Julia's talk is largely on agreement with the challenges being raised here. But some queer think about the context for that challenge, and also I think some suggestions from my experience about where the solutions might lie. So thinking first of all on, I suppose I should reflect the way that the work is happening in Scotland to provide reassurance. Julia's comments at the end about the need for collaboration across various sectors, including academia, is absolutely the way we want to be taking that forward in Scotland. You could legitimately argue that it's easier for Scotland to do that and maybe Wales to do that than in England, because it's a smaller country, a smaller set of people, easier for us to make the right contacts and collaborate. So we have established a partnership in 2022, a public sector partnership, to develop natural capital markets in Scotland, but to develop them in a way that's values-led, so that is aligning to policy. So this is something I wanted to pick up, was the way that Julia's talk framed the purpose of natural capital markets. I think maybe just because of the way the talk was set out, but we have a broader framing for that in Scotland. It's not just about delivering nature conservation outcomes, it's about delivering wider policy outcomes for the economy and society and communities. So that's a very important strand, that when we think about natural capital markets, there are a number of benefits that they can provide. It's not just, although they need to demonstrate they're providing effective restoration and improvements in the natural environment, absolutely, but those improvements yield a number of benefits. And if we're going to make the case for nature and the case for private investment, then building in those broader benefits is important. So that's one thing I wanted to highlight. I think next is, in terms of looking at kind of how we put together the structures for effective natural capital markets, there is something, we're not operating in a vacuum. So we've had the Peatland Code and the Woodland Carbon Code have been in place for over 10 years now, around 15 years for the Woodland Carbon Code. So we have high integrity, well, we hope, and I think we can demonstrate high integrity mechanisms for natural capital investment in Scotland, but they're not fixed, they're evolving, and they are looking to improve, and new versions of both those codes are being issued this year. So I think when we look at what we need to do for any nature market, including the emerging ones for biodiversity and nature restoration rather than capture of natural carbon, we need to learn from the experience of the Peatland Code and Woodland Carbon Code within the UK, and then look at the experiences, both bad and good, from markets elsewhere. One thing I was going to point to was the fact that the European Union has committed to developing markets for both for biodiversity, but also for natural carbon. And they're bringing their considerable resources and expertise to bear on development of markets. They're looking to engage with the UK and with Scotland based on our experience. So I think when we look at the challenge, and I absolutely agree there are challenges around metrics and integrity, we have quite a lot we can work with, as well as what we need, further work we need to develop. So I would pick that out. The other theme I would pick out, I think, is these challenges for nature markets, private investment in nature restoration and nature markets. They're not unique to private markets. They're a shared one with public investment. So that came through in your talk, and I think absolutely agree with the point you made at the end about actually thinking about biodiversity in the context of private investment is really focusing our minds on the need for good metrics and proper demonstration of creditable outcomes. And in many cases, there is a greater rigor required than has been the case in our measurement of what we're getting back for the public investment in nature restoration. And we're seeing that come to pass in our own work in Scotland, which Julia on the call has been helping with, and others I no doubt on the call have been helping with, in thinking about developing an ecosystem restoration code in Scotland. How do we develop a effective high integrity mechanism for the investment in the restoration of nature? That leads me on to another point, which is just the contrast across the UK and the kind of policy lab opportunity that provides, often not intended in a beneficial way, but there are different politics that, as you will be well aware, applying across the UK in different approaches. So we don't have a biodiversity net gain approach in Scotland, nor does Wales. And, you know, we're looking at how biodiversity net gain operates in England. And I think I would like to challenge one of the statements in your talk about the benefit of developers being more aware of nature in their approach. You know, that is a theoretical benefit, but I think it also needs to be accompanied by a demonstration that that awareness is actually leading to an overall improvement in the state of nature and the state of biodiversity compared to our null hypothesis. And is that null hypothesis the development goes ahead without that awareness of nature, or that the development doesn't go ahead and we're left with that nature in place? Because I think both are possible. So, you know, and you see there are a number of papers recently that have been looking at the experience of biodiversity net gain so far and what improvements and adjustments could be made from different perspectives, because people come at it, you know, some with a focus on how development can be facilitated and some with a focus on how biodiversity can be protected and enhanced, and that leads to different questions. So I really welcome the talk, but I had a number of thoughts, I suppose, on areas where further discussion or further emphasis could be there. And I think largely further reassurance for everybody on the call that there is, to finish, there is a lot going on across the UK which is seeking to address these issues in a constructive way. One I haven't mentioned so far, but which I've listed in the point I've entered in the chat, is the BSI Nature Markets Programme, which is a collaborative piece of work across all the UK governments, led by UK government, looking to, I suppose, demonstrate what good looks like in terms of high integrity markets, nature markets in the UK. The overarching principles standard has been published, which I think is a good product that should provide reassurance for people, and that will be followed next year by more detailed standards on carbon markets and biodiversity markets. So it'll be interesting to see what all the people on this call make of that detail and whether it provides people with confidence that markets that sign up to those standards are in fact high integrity and delivering, you know, the good practice that we're all seeking. So I'll stop there and pass on to the callers, but many thanks for the chat. And I've put some links in the chat myself. I'm more than happy if anybody wants to talk any further about the work we're doing in Scotland, then please do get in touch with me directly and happily have that further discussion. And I hope the chat and the Q&A following this go well. So cheers.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ross, and good luck catching your ferry. That was really great. Then we'll move on to Rob Jordan.
Thank you, and again, thank you to Julia for a really interesting talk. It's a perspective I don't often get on sort of on the ground doing stuff, and so actually it's really nice to get out of that world and start thinking about some of these bigger jigsaw pieces, how they fit together. My background is, originally public sector, so I spent 10 years in the Treasury, sort of running around doing stuff, making up policy, and then spent 10 years on the investment side, working in private equity and impact investment, largely emerging market, but also then working on some nature-focused stuff. And then in the last 3 years have moved down to Barnstable and focused on a regional platform, trying to use North Devon as a living lab for natural environment innovation. And we are doing a few things that I think are relevant here. Partly, we have a natural capital marketplace where we explicitly try to create at-scale projects, take forward natural capital stuff. Partly also, we've got a Smart Biosphere, which is a natural environment data platform. I think those are probably the two most relevant bits. And I suppose my perspective on all this is unashamedly pragmatic. I'm very focused on what can we do right now and how can we get things moving. I suppose to start with this sort of overall, and I should say I agree with the vast majority, if not all, of what Julia presented, but I would say that is verification of outcomes the key challenge holding back natural capital right now? I would argue not. I don't think it is. Because focus on the UK, because that's where I've spent the last 3 years in terms of real focus on the nature finance world. if you look at the sort of three key established markets right now, wood and carbon, peat and carbon, and BNG, I don't think verification of outcomes is the key challenge holding back any of those markets right now. All of them are poorly functioning markets right now. They are dramatically subscale and largely not functioning as markets. If you take BNG as an example, the challenge there is largely on the demand side, the fact that the system is predicated is explicitly designed to reward on-site development, also on-site sort of offset of biodiversity loss, which is actually right. That's the correct policy design, but actually that then makes trading for biodiversity offsets off-site quite hard, and that's what we're seeing across the market right now. There is very little demand nationally for PNG, so I don't think that verification outcomes is the key challenge within BNG. And I also think within the BNG systems, and maybe this is sort of the same for other markets, that actually that focus on verification of outcomes potentially misses the point slightly. Clearly, it's very important for us to understand that, but actually the BNG system is predicated on creating habitat game plans where you work with a landowner on designing a series of interventions which are logically designed to result in biodiversity improvements. And then you hold them to account in the delivery of those plans. And ultimately, yes, there is an MRV system to look at kind of what impact that had. But actually, for me, a system where where we get those habitat game plans right, where we've got the evidence to design those habitat game plans in the right way, where we then have a system that holds the landowner to account for the delivery against those habitat game plans, for me, that's a pretty good system, and I'd be pretty happy with that. And I think logically, a large part of the time, that will follow through into the outcomes that we need. But then, and I think this is kind of agreeing with some of what Judy said in the talk, I would argue that the bar that we're setting then for these private finance interventions is also dramatically different from the bar that we set for public sector funded interventions. My background in the Treasury, so I spent my last 3 years there as head of international development spending, so sort of involved in setting the overall UK's budget for international development and then looking at project approvals beside that. So I've sort of got the macro view on grants and the success to them. But then also I've got the micro view right now, trying to sort of put together and then deliver really high quality grant funded projects. And on average, I would say that grant funded projects at the moment are not delivering, or certainly are the rigor with which we hold them to account doesn't allow us to know the whole time as to whether or not they're delivering. So very often they're driven by funder priorities, not necessarily kind of prioritization of outcomes. Very often minimal budget for monitoring, very often not rigorous enough systems to work out the kind of verification piece, zero connectivity between projects to look at them as a whole, and very little sustainability on kind of around projects. Like, it's often really hard to know a project that finished 5 years ago, the level of kind of data that's held on that project is often really kind of pitiful. And so actually I would say that the average position in the kind of conservation and grant funded conservation world is really poor, and that actually, as Julia said, this sort of private finance world has the opportunity to really move things forward quite dramatically, and that's really exciting. But then I suppose the final set of points I'd make is that actually the both public sector sort of grant funded conservation and these existing markets are barely scratching the surface in terms of what's needed and the potential here, and don't really present the kind of at scale investment opportunities that's badly needed in this market. When I was a sort of development economics student, sort of back in my 20s, I became really obsessed with this Peruvian economist, Hernando de Soto, who wrote about property rights. He was convinced that the key thing holding back a whole lot of developing countries around the world was the lack of formal property rights. So effectively, by establishing formal property rights, you put yourself into the modern financial system, which is then mortgages are designed on that. The whole financial system and the ability to invest in an economy is predicated on understanding who owns what. And so ideally, with this one kind of silver bullet intervention of establishing property rights, you unlock all future development, which is clearly a stretch, but there's also huge evidence based on the value of getting that right. I would argue we're in that similar inflection point right now around natural capital that's really exciting. The key intervention isn't establishing who owns what in the same way as the property rights. I would argue that the key intervention right now is around understanding nature, that the level of data that we hold right now just really isn't sufficient for us to really kind of drive that future opportunity at the scale that it potentially could be. And I think it's the sort of World Economic Forum that put a made up number on ecosystem services globally, but I think the number of 125 trillion is the number they came out with. But essentially the value of nature to human beings right now is colossal, but the level of understanding of how to optimize that nature is very weak right now. And that is because we have such poor understanding of nature data. There's increasing interest in nature data, and it's really exciting, but the system historically, and even right now, is still one where nature data is held in silos, where data is not speaking to each other, and where we can't integrate that data and actually understand the correlation of different data sets. For me, this is the really exciting opportunity that's ahead of us over the next 5-10 years, is thinking about this data integration piece, and then using nature as an engineered solution to man-made problems. When you look at the natural capital investment opportunities that are actually getting investor interest in the UK right now, it's not really the carbon markets, in my opinion, or BNG. Those are really hard to scale and get things at scale. Actually, it's things like natural flood management that investors are focusing on. That's where the investment funds are focusing right now, or starting to think about supply chain resilience. How can you package up regenerative agriculture measures in such a way that you evidence the benefit to the supply chain and then can monetize that? And that, for me, is the future of natural capital, is thinking about where we can really clearly evidence the benefit of nature as an engineered solution to man-made problems. That's the colossally exciting part that we're really focused on. That's why we're developing the smart biosphere and other things as our kind of solution to, I suppose, at a regional level, looking at the integration of natural environment data. I'm going to pause there. I could go on for ages, but I'm going to pause there.
That's brilliant, Robin. Perhaps you can put a link in the chat to the work that you're doing in the biosphere. I'm sure people on the call will be interested in that. Great. So then we move on to Kath to give a Welsh perspective.
Great, thank you to Julia and to the panelists that have come before me. I'll try and add both the Welsh perspective and add to what's come before as well, not sort of repeating. Again, thanks again for the invitation. My name's Catherine Howell. I'm Head of Natural Capital Developments at Bangor National Park, formerly Brecon Beacons. I've been in post for about 11 months, and I think what's interesting about my post is that it's funded by Welsh Government to pioneer these sort of approaches. In the Welsh environment, we don't have a BNG legislation in planning law. We have what's called NBB, net benefit for biodiversity. And what happens under that law is developers will negotiate with our planning ecologists, and through that negotiation, look to earmark a project and or money for nature. On the whole, we believe the evidence is stacking up that BNG is probably a better legislative environment to be operating in for nature than NBB, on the condition that it's still very imperfect. And as Rob has said, we're way away from the kind of scale that we need here. So I think it's just to say that Wales is we're currently operating in a very different environment from both England and Scotland. And I think there's opportunity, maybe as Ross was sort of alluding to, that perhaps we need a bit of a UK community of practice. We're sort of developing one in Wales that sort of sits within the Welsh legislation, but we're all sort of at different stages of development. And I think there's a lot to kind of learn from each other here. In national parks, I think the perspective here is quite interesting. National parks, protected landscapes across the whole of the UK account for about 25% of land in the UK. So I think there's a huge role for national parks, who are playing already brokering and intermediation role here, and can add to that sort of integrity in these markets. So in terms of some of, I guess, sort of leaning on a little bit of like the Welsh angle and some of the reflections as well to the presentation earlier. If we think about the sell side, right, we're talking about our cultural heritage, our farming communities in Wales. This is often something that is completely missed in these big conferences on nature finance. When we talk about like marginal land for nature, this is somebody's livelihoods in Wales. And 80 to 90% of land in Wales is currently agricultural land. And of those farms, the vast majority, like 50 to 60% of Welsh farms, are quite small. They're under 20 hectares in size. So, when you look at the current markets, they're not really working for really the landowners that could be nature, like farmers becoming stewards of nature, right? That's what we're also talking about here. Because markets can have an adverse impact, and we've seen some examples where land has been bought and then you credit off potential cash flow from carbon or biodiversity, And it's potentially an outside investor coming in. So where you used to have a kind of forestry investment, now you'd have a natural capital plus forestry investment, right? That in itself may not be a bad thing, but what happens in some of those deals is that you're not getting any sort of the local economic participation or leadership in the future of what happens to some of this land. So we really do have to speak from and with and co-produce these sort of futures, right, with our farming community. And we speak to the farming community and you talk about carbon, woodland carbon, peatland carbon, but what about soil carbon? And as Rob has said, I think the big win here, especially in Wales, is flooding. In terms of, can we use the power of nature to increase the infiltration rates in soils? One of the partners to the Usk catchment, so across the national park, we have huge catchments. 50% of the water that falls that gets drunk in Wales falls in the national park. And a lot of the farming practices that have been driven by different policies over the last decades, as we all know, the intensification of farming has meant that soil infiltration rates have fallen, and that's leading to increased incidences of flooding and poor outcomes as well on the drought and low flow side. So I think the market for flood management, we're seeing big coalitions emerge there. I think the data and evidence side of that is still to emerge at a level of scale, I think, that's needed. But I think that's a sort of, big sector that we need to kind of keep working on and investing in. And within all of that, I think what's coming at us as well when we speak to our farming community is, how do we think about, maintenance payments for either existing good land? Because, one of the things that I think we're talking about in the presentation is this role of additionality. But what about existing forestry and the maintenance of existing forestry, and how does that kind of get paid for? It's not to say the private sector picks up the bill for all of this, but I'm just sort of reflecting into this conversation some of the things we're hearing from what is considered to be the sell side of this market. And I think, Rob's already kind of pressed on some of the big buy side challenges and opportunities. I think, in this sort of space of flood management, we're speaking here about, in some shape or form right now, like prevention pounds, right? Operational resilience. Right now, our communities, roads, railways are getting shut because of the recent flooding in Monmouthshire and around the areas that we work in. And that is a cost to society, both in human life and well-being, as well as economic costs. And what happens to that money, right? Where does that cost get borne? So a good example is in, the fines. Network Rail get fined every time a rail goes down, but some of those fines don't go back into nature-based solutions. So, one of the questions we are working with some of the big utility and infrastructure companies on is also this question of how does nature become a solution to the challenges you have in your business? And that conversation needs to be at the boardroom level, the CEO level, not on the sort of side of the desk on a corporate social responsibility or even sustainability. It needs to be a financially viable program of work. And I think we will get there on this conversation. We can't, the free rider problems, but that's where I think some of these big conversations are going to happen, is when it becomes part of business operational resilience. Food and farming, of course, the future of farming, heavily dependent on the resilience of the production of food. So I think these sort of questions are definitely coming up for us, where, in terms of opportunities, we have a whole innovation portfolio of projects. We're really trying to work across different innovation spaces. I think there's also a role for the development banks, as Julie has mentioned. This isn't about the public sector taking a step out, right? I think the public sector leans into this space. So, what's the role of the public sector in procurement or advanced market commitments in off-taking regenerative horticulture, right? To de-risk farmers' moving into more regenerative practices. You know, and we're in kind of various conversations with the Welsh Government, Development Bank of Wales on some of these ideas. And I think just to close, you know, perhaps it is coming a little bit back to Rob's point here, is where we are in these markets is nowhere near where we need to be in terms of the scale of investment that's needed for nature's recovery. And I think what we will see is a continued layered approach all the way from, you know, philanthropy, which needs to, again, grants and philanthropy need to kind of up the game in terms of outcomes, all the way up the capital stack to investments. So I think we're going to continue to work across different capitals and continue to learn. So, you know, that's where for us sharing, being part of these reflections, I'm very much learning as I go in this job, is critically important, so that this, especially in the Welsh context where we have the Wellbeing of Future Generation Act, it works towards a well-being economy. And I think that's something that we need to kind of constantly point to, is that nature has been subsidiarized in the past decades, and it's at the center of almost every economic system. So I will pause there. Again, could talk for more longer, but I won't. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Kath. And then we'll move on to our final panelist, Julia McCarthy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Nice to meet you all. And Julia and panelists, thank you for such a great discussion. I'm happy to add to it today. So thanks for having me, Mark. So I'm a freshwater ecologist by training and background, and currently a researcher at University of Edinburgh, exploring the nexus between biodiversity and nature finance. I'm going to mix things up a bit in my kind of reflections and shift geographies on you, just so that what I say is kind of adding on to kind of what the other panelists have said instead of being repetitive. So my experiences and reflections today are primarily rooted in the United States Clean Water Act driven stream and wetland markets in the States. This is a context that I've worked within for nearly 2 decades. So these markets have been around for many decades and have the fortune of being regulatory driven compensation markets. So just for a bit of context for those who aren't familiar, these markets revolve around permitting impacts to wetlands and streams, where unavoidable impacts are preferably offset by credits from mitigation banks or in lieu fee programs, but can also be offset by the entity that's requesting the permit to impact streams and wetlands in the first place. So I wanted to kind of focus on 2 points within Julia's talk. The first is around this idea of units of nature and what do you measure? So when it comes to units of nature across the states, there's actually a broad range of crediting protocols that outline how stream and wetland credits are calculated. While increasingly we're seeing crediting approaches incorporate function-based condition assessments, there are still actually many that don't. So this means that credits are can be awarded based on area or length alone, or sometimes along with other ratios or multipliers that are defined in the protocols. So certainly, we're finding that moving towards more science-based crediting approaches that incorporate condition assessments can be really beneficial. So having units of nature that incorporate or quantify changes in condition from baseline to post-project helps us to better incentivize ecological outcomes by building this uplift into the value of a credit. And I think it also helps to shift away from credit frameworks that are built on activity-based incentives. But in kind of the real world of implementing this market, robust quantification is often really difficult. So regulators and the regulated public want approaches that are objective and repeatable, but also rapid and cost effective, which can limit the scientific rigor and the resulting accuracy of any approach that's used. So in some ways, what you measure is as much a social question as a scientific one. Metrics may be imperfect, kind of as Julia alluded to, because there needs to be a balance to provide scientifically based methods while also ensuring efficiency and ease of implementation. So I think, all of us will know that it can be complex and expensive to assess ecosystem functions directly. So rapid field-based structural or compositional indicators are often used in the states as proxies. So these point-in-time condition indicators will always create some level of variability and measurement, although this can kind of be helped with good method protocols and good training, for example, to ensure data are always collected at the same time of the year. And we also know that some types of metrics, so like those that are informed by direct measurements or directed visual estimates, are much more repeatable and reliable than more subjective approaches. But we also need to think about how well these indicators work at the relevant scale or within a new regional or site-specific context. So what indicators you measure is just as important as how accurate and reliable your measures are. So are the indicators responsive and sensitive to the types of change that you expect to see, both on the impact and the restoration side of the equation? And will the indicators incentivize kind of the right actions in the right place, or will they drive projects towards a smaller set of designer objectives, or even worse, homogenization or simplification of nature, or other unintended outcomes? So I could probably talk about these issues all day around metrics, but I want to also then touch on kind of the another point from Julia's talk, which is just the bigger question, I think, about whether market-based approaches can deliver for nature. And I think, one part of this equation is certainly getting your condition assessments and your measurements right. But the other part of the answer, as Julia alluded to briefly, is around effective regulation. So well-functioning nature markets need robust rules to ensure, one, that the mitigation hierarchy is well implemented. So this creates real economic incentives to avoid and minimize impacts before any type of compensation or contributions claimed. And as Julia said earlier, this really gets people thinking about nature earlier in their own decision-making. And it also means less impacts to begin with. So we're reducing the water that's filling the bathtub. And then secondly, there also need to be rules so that projects that are selling credits are held accountable to deliver what's promised. In the States, the current rules that we have in place and standards were informed by around 30 years of experience running the program, a great deal of scientific advancement in our understanding of streams and wetland ecosystems over the decades, and numerous program evaluations that helped identify and fix problems. So these hard-won lessons from early days of the program had led to significant regulatory reform. And the rules that we have in place now in the States require robust and equivalent standards for all compensatory mitigation projects, including those generating and selling credits, to ensure projects deliver on their ecological objectives. So these standards that we're operating under in the States now have been in place for nearly 2 decades. And while they're not without their challenges, they've improved the quality of projects, they've improved the efficiency of their review and predictability in the marketplace, which has really brought in a lot of investment. And I think with the right standards and flexibility for policy innovation, it is possible for market-based approaches to deliver for nature. And just lastly, I just really want to emphasize that the importance of the role ecologists and scientists play in this to ensure policy decisions are informed by good science. So thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Julia. It's been great to have these reflections from Scotland, England, Wales, and also internationally from the States. So we have about 20 minutes, maybe slightly 18 or 17 minutes for some questions from the audience. And what I'd like to, there are plenty of questions in the chat already, but what I'd like to do is to see whether it works to get folk to raise their hand and then ask their question directly. So if you have a question that's already in the chat, but you'd like to raise it, or if you have another question that you haven't written in the chat yet, please raise your hand, and whilst hopefully a couple of hands will pop up, I'll just ask a first question, which was sort of posed at the bottom of a very long thread by Peter McCann, and he asks for some reflections from the panelists on the role that nature markets might have in further commodifying nature, preventing transitions to just futures and behaving as a distraction. And this is sort of encapsulates quite a few critiques that are often posed towards nature markets. So maybe if we can have a quick reflection from Julia Jones to start off with, and then we'll see whether there are hands raised or whether there's time for reflections from other panelists. But Julia, first for you.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. And there's some really interesting work done by political ecologists reflecting on this. And, there are some people I respect very deeply who write incredibly articulately from a very critical perspective of nature markets and essentially framing them as a distraction. I think that's an argument that can absolutely be made. I keep very much an open mind. I'm at heart an optimist, and at heart I come back towards. So I'm incredibly aware of the challenges. So I've chosen to speak about two particular challenges that I have research experience on, these two measurement challenges. Before that, I spent about a decade looking at the impacts of REDD+ projects on social issues. And I'm very interested in the kind of equity questions of who benefits and who loses out when something becomes a market. And that's something else I could talk about at length. So I guess what my answer would be, it's not a particularly satisfying answer. It's quite an academic answer. It's quite it depends. You can look at it both ways, etc. kind of answers. But my personal answer is that I am cautiously optimistic that the attention that the nature market world is bringing to nature and fundamentally putting nature on the balance sheet will be, on average, in general, a positive, as long as, with the big caveat, that that scrutiny and engagement from academics that Julia referred to, and that collaboration and general involvement across academia, industry, practice-based organizations and policy, as long as that happens. But completely take your point and understand your skepticism.
So I don't see any raised hands yet, so I don't know whether Kath, Julia, or Rob wants to add to Julia's response. Kath?
I think the question also asked us to think about the just transition here. And I think we don't have the answers yet, right? But we have design principles that we work with, and we also work within a policy environment in Wales around well-being economics. So, we can look to the climate movement to know that, large-scale renewables has been both good for reducing our dependency on fossil fuels, but hasn't necessarily been a fully just transition, right? Community Energy Wales do brilliant work on pre-distribution sort of equity stakes in large-scale solar and small-scale solar or wind projects. And so I think we are continued to ask that question of what does community leadership and ownership mean in this space? And, that's something that I'm hoping to kind of, bring through some of our work. And we have great examples of partners that we're working with who are working, not just with the land owner, but across the whole community on sort of nature recovery at a state level scale. So who gains from this future is definitely front and center of our work, but we haven't sort of figured out all of the mechanisms by which that unfolds yet.
Brilliant, Kath. And I see that, Kamal, you raised your hand. Go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, I really thoroughly enjoyed and was avidly listening to every word that all of you have said this evening. What I was going to ask was, how do we ensure that ecosystem services, I mean, Julia was talking about in the USA that sort of different types of markets are being developed for different aspects of landscape or biodiversity. But how do we ensure that, and there's the carbon markets, of course, but how do we ensure that ecosystem services such as pollution control and air quality, I mean, how do we quantify or value sort of, I mean, will that existentially happen? That the valuation of ecosystem services, I suppose.
Great. So ecosystem services in relation to
develop. How is that going to develop? Will it develop? No. how far do
other-
we need to go in terms of valuing, what we get from nature?
That's a really good question. So how do other ecosystem services fit in? Rob, I think you sort of pointed to some of that in your response, that it was these wider ecosystem services or nature-based solutions that were probably, or maybe as relevant or more relevant than biodiversity credits. Isn't that one of the things that you mentioned?
Yeah, and just quickly to respond on the previous question, I'm an unashamed fan of the commodification of nature. I think it will be such an important factor for the human race and for the planet, and that ultimately that comes down to rigor around impact measurement and actually having systems that account properly for negative impacts as well as positive impacts, so we can actually take an integrated view. I sit in a rural and coastal community where actually, like, Northern Devon hasn't participated in previous waves of growth. The opportunity ahead of it that comes from natural capital is amazing, but it needs to be done right, and there are huge risks. Take BNG as just a very simple example. There are examples of large groups buying out large sections of the countryside away from the landowners that have managed it for generations, and that, I would say, is a negative impact and needs to be considered and needs to be mitigated in some way. So anyway, that's my response to that. On the ecosystem services point, I think and I say this as someone who's on the back foot because of the location we're in. We don't have very large corporates in Devon that stand to, or certainly in North Devon, that stand to benefit from ecosystem services. We don't have particularly large population bases. We don't have particularly large parts of sort of nationally important infrastructure. Ultimately, though, we need to find a buyer who's going to stand to benefit from those ecosystem services, or stand to benefit from the optimization of those ecosystem services over time. That is ultimately what will drive this. Yes, there will also be a market that will be public sector grant funded for the type of sort of public goods that are generated through ecosystem services. But I suppose the opportunities that I was focusing on, the ones where we can evidence the impacts to an organization that is willing to pay for it. And that is where the market will go, in my opinion.
Do you think we'll see taxes, people having to pay taxes for ecosystem services? If you want to live here, you have to pay.
I mean, ultimately, yes, but that will speak to, so that doesn't speak to the part of the market I was focusing on. I'm talking about a sort of contract between the delivery of ecosystem services and an organization that is then delivering it. But then ultimately, things like water quality will have to be funded through, in part, where there isn't sort of an obvious beneficiary that is able to pay for it. Ultimately, that will have to be funded through general taxation, and that could be a kind of predicated system that's more local. That could be a national one.
Great. We're going to move on to our next question, just to give more people an opportunity in the limited time that we still have. So we'll move on to Daisy, please.
Hi, thanks everyone for the webinar, super interesting. I just had a question about the background research on sort of voluntary biodiversity credit pricing, and if there's any evidence about combining carbon and biodiversity credits, and whether there's any significant impact on credit prices.
Who would like to respond to that?
If anyone else wants to come in, I haven't got anything particularly interesting to say, because your question is specifically about the impact on prices. So there's long been labels, biodiversity labels for traded credits. So, for example, credits, avoided deforestation carbon credits traded on the voluntary carbon market could be labelled as CCBA compliant, the Climate Community and Biodiversity Alliance. So that was essentially a stamp to say that they were delivering something for biodiversity on the side. It was kind of a label rather than a separate, which could of course increase and did increase the value paid, the price paid in the market for those credits. But that's different from what you're talking about, which is the stacking of biodiversity credits and carbon credits from the same area of land. There's a lot of work going on about that, but I don't think I have anything really useful to say. So if anyone else wants to come in, go ahead.
I see blank faces from the rest of the panel.
It's just, yeah, I mean, it's just to say you're happy to share, get in contact with me if you want more details on this. But you can attract a premium in price, but there's a lot of sort of bilateral trade deals happening in this space. There's not like a huge amount of transparency on where you could get sort of you know, where you attract that premium from, but there is a premium to be had, and you do run into sort of like bundling and stacking issues. So the short answer is yes, it should attract a premium, not just because you're bundling up carbon and biodiversity, but you could also be bundling up other ecosystem services if you can indeed measure them. So a good example of that is riparian planting around catchment areas. There's huge water quality benefits from that. There's, as Rob said, it's sort of finding your buyer, finding not just the willingness to buy those outcomes, but at the right price as well. And I think there's really interesting work around the price economics, and I think DEFRA potentially coming out with a fund to buy pending issuance units as well. So yeah, loads of issues around, you know, the time horizons on when your buyers buy those carbon credits as well, and when your landowners need them, but we'll get into that today.
Great, thank you very much.
Great. Katie, you're next in line.
Thanks. Sorry, it's Kat.
Oh,
I know it's different on the screen. Yeah, my question is, I went to a very interesting BNG summit for NSIPs last week. That's nationally significant infrastructure projects. So I wanted to ask how the speakers think the mandate of BNG for NSIPs will change the market, especially once we go a few years in, once the DCOs have been approved and there's they need to start thinking about it or delivering it. And also how this understanding of BNG will also, do they think it will change the understanding of NBS at boardroom level, and in turn increase uptake for Task Force for Nature financial disclosure? I've got that the wrong way around, I think. Yeah. So yeah, any thoughts? Because I think all of those are interlinked to how the market's going to change and grow.
I can come in on that if you want, Mark. So we spent a lot of time analysing the BNG market and trying to think about demand and what's going to unlock it, or what point is it going to move. I think the reality is that the NSIP market is still pretty small in the UK, and so you've got the order of 25 development consent orders every year, and about half of those are large solar projects where implicitly there isn't a lot of biodiversity loss on site, or they're able to offset it on the site itself. So the number of kind of projects that are going to result, it can be things like new reservoirs, it's going to be those sort of projects that are going to result in dramatic biodiversity loss, which will then make a big difference to a biodiversity market locally. But actually at the national level, is it going to make a big difference? I don't really know. I mean, the reality with the BNG market right now is it's completely dominated by purchases of 0 to 5 units. That is what is fueling the market nationally right now. And with the consultation the government's doing right now, there's a potential for that part of the market to be taken away. So I think the BNG market is in a whole world of pain, and I'm really interested to see the way it goes. On your second question about sort of, will BNG result in a change of mindset at the board level around nature-based solutions? I think largely not. I don't think, but because the BNG market is so focused on developers and construction projects, I don't think your average corporate has a clue about BNG, or it's not something they would necessarily think about. I do think corporates are starting to think more about disclosure and thinking about nature-based solutions, but we're right at the start of that.
I'm thinking when this is after the NSIPs have sort of started to have to incorporate BNG.
So I don't. Listen, I'm not
the
expert on the extent to which corporates engage with these nationally significant infrastructure projects, but I don't think kind of corporates at large in the UK necessarily engage with NSIPs that much. But I could be wrong on that.
Great. So looking at. Oh, Julia, briefly.
Sorry, I was just going to add, I think the question about these nationally significant infrastructure projects is an interesting one. And I think, just going back to some perspectives from the US markets, like some of the first mitigation banks that we saw emerging in the 90s were single service banks. So they were your larger infrastructure providers, your departments of transportation and whatnot, that were engaged in their longer term planning. And they were looking at the impacts that were on their kind of planning horizon. And so then they were making these larger investments in nature because they knew the offsets needed to be coming. And so that's really kind of what the early development of the banks in the States was. So, you know, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speak for kind of what's happening in England, but it's an interesting precursor or potentially a historical parallel to maybe what could happen there with that.
Brilliant. So in the interest of time, I'd like to ask our speaker, Julia Jones, to maybe briefly provide a couple of sentences on final reflections from this panel discussion and the general Q&A before I round up and close the webinar.
Wow, it's been amazing. And thank you so much to the panelists. I mean, your reflections were all absolutely brilliant. I was scribbling a million different responses, but we can follow up later on that. I guess if I was just going to end on one point. So something Rob said was the value of nature to people or to society is colossal. Well, I would say more than that, any estimate of a value, however big the estimate is, will be an underestimate of infinity. So we are so dependent on nature for everything. And we have to find a way to put nature on the balance sheet in decision making. And I'm really encouraged to hear to be reminded of just how many initiatives there are and how many people are working in this space that are thinking about it in a very nuanced way. So that's been really positive to get today. So I don't really have anything else to say. I haven't actually prepared a summing up, but I've been listening hard and enjoying it very much. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Julia. And that's one of the things we try to do in Landscape Ecology UK is bring together different perspectives, but also the academic and the practitioner and the policy perspectives. And that leads to really great conversations. It also shows how messy and complicated things are in real life. And they end up in topics that you can discuss late into the evening, or which works at our conferences. You can go to the pub and discuss them forever, but at an online webinar, we have to draw things to a close at a certain point. So I just want to have a couple of final things I wanted to say. Well, first of all, for folk, if you enjoyed today's talk and you're interested in landscape ecology, then we are the organisation for landscape ecology in the UK, and think about joining us. We're cheap, so £15 for students and £30 for professionals. Most of that money goes to the international organizations to support developing countries, set up Landscape Ecology UK chapters, or support students to attend conferences. And some of it goes to us for our running costs. We have a couple of things coming up that I just wanted to tell you about. So we're restarting our Landscape Connections webinar series in the new year. Members of the new committee are very enthusiastic to put on a monthly series. So there will be monthly events focused on landscape scale nature recovery, starting in February with a talk with colleagues from Forestry England to share some of their experience. And the series of monthly events will accumulate in our annual conference in Manchester, Nature Recovery for Resilient Landscapes. So 7th to the 9th of July, first 2 days inside, last day field trips. So save the date, and early 2026 will open for abstract submissions. So look out for our news on socials or on our website. And on that note, I'd like to draw the webinar to a close. We do have our annual meeting, which will start in 5 minutes. So folk who may be interested to learn more about what we do or how you could get involved in Landscape Ecology UK, you're very welcome to stay on the call and join us in 5 minutes. We'll talk through what we've been doing in the past year and share some more of our plans, but fully realize that it's been a long sit already and it's reaching the end of the day and that many will want to log off. But thanks so much to everyone for joining. It's been a hugely successful webinar, at least in attendance numbers, and I enjoyed it very much and hope to see many of you again at future events.
Thank you.